Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you?
I'm doing especially good tonight, Ray. Tell the audience why.
Well, our guest today is Natalie Schilling. Natalie holds a PhD in linguistics and is a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. She's published 85-plus academic and general audience works and delivered over 150 presentations at various international academic venues. Natalie also served as a forensic linguistic consultant to attorneys and law enforcement. Natalie, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
And technically, Natalie is Professor Emerita, Georgetown University. She can explain that. And I should also add here, for our audience's sake, full disclosure, Natalie Schilling is my wife.
Wow. Hey, before we even get into anything, that in itself, Natalie, I see the halo hanging over your head. And I know that halo comes from with Jim. But I have to ask this question, and I've never asked you this before, but what was it like having an actor play you in a really successful TV series?
Which time are you referring to?
Well, I hate when she does that. Well, okay. Full disclosure, she's had two actors portray her in two different series. I've only had one. This comes up at least once a week over dinner, driving to, while we're shopping. But anyway.
Not to leave Jim shunned, but a manhunt Unabomber. In that case there, that one there.
And the other one, you tell them up front, Natalie.
Okay, yes. So I haven't been an actor on TV, but I've been played on TV, sort of, kind of. Not once, but twice, as I frequently like to remind Jim, who's been played once on TV. So in Manhunt Unabomber, in the miniseries, there's a character named Natalie Rogers. So we share a first name. We share a lot of characteristics. Natalie is a linguist as well. She teaches at a university, different university that I spend most of my career at. But so she teaches at a university. She teaches linguistics, and she helps in matters involving language evidence. In that case, she helped with the Unabomber case and analyzing the manifesto. So she's based partly on me. That's where Natalie comes from. We share the same first name. Her last name, Rogers, comes from, is borrowed from a linguist by the name of Roger Shy, who is somebody we regard as a founder of the field of forensic linguistics, which, as I'm sure your audience members know, involves analyzing language evidence. And Roger actually is also a professor emerita of Georgetown University. So he and I share a number of connections too.
Well,
did they get it right? Did they get it right? Did they get it right?
That's a great question. Yes and no. I was impressed with how they got some of the linguistic information very accurate, their understandings of how dialects work, how you can use dialect features to help you profile an anonymous author in the case of the Unabomber. So, for example, in the series, Natalie and Fitz examine the manifesto, and they talk about usages such as, well, look at his citation style. It looks like the style of, and these are 1960s academic dissertations. So they're looking directly at language features to help them assess, well, is this a guy who has an advanced degree from a certain time period? So that's, classically how we do linguistic profiling when we do forensic linguistics. So they got a lot of that stuff right. What they didn't get right about me is Natalie in the series has, I believe, one or two dogs. And I've never been a dog person. I'm a cat person. So that's what they didn't get right.
And just so we'll get this part over with, and then I'll move on from my jealousy. And there was a series before that, Criminal Minds. Tell us about that particular connection. Real Natalie.
Right. I will. So there's a character in Criminal Minds. I can't remember exactly which seasons she comes in, but her name is Alex Blake.
Seasons 9 and 10.
Seasons 9 and 10. Her name is Alex Blake, and she's very interesting because she is a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. I believe she's actually at Georgetown. And at the same time, she somehow happens to be a special agent with the FBI. So she's somehow holding down these two very demanding jobs. I don't know exactly how she manages it, except that she has these amazing teaching assistants that when the FBI calls her with a forensic linguistic emergency in the middle of class, she can turn to her teaching assistant and say, Jeremy, take over the class now. And, working at Georgetown all these years, comes with its, we do have some perks, we do have some benefits, but I'm not sure we ever really had the benefit of any time we needed to leave class for something, we could just turn to this army of teaching assistants to take over for us. But she's a character then that's based partly on me, but in a way also partly on Fitz, because, special agent FBI working in forensic linguistic cases. And so the actor who played Alex Blake, who played kind of the me-ish character in that series, that's Jean Triplehorn. So many of your audience members will be familiar with her. She's a big name actor. And I remember when Fitz and I met her, she came up to us. Jim, you probably remember this too. And she came up to us. I think she even hugged us and she said, Mom, Dad, as if each of us has given our DNA to her and her character. So.
Well, let me back up a little bit. The summer before, because one actor left Criminal Minds after season 8, they hired Jean Triplehorn, and I'm sitting around the table out at the studio with the writers, and they do their round tables, whatever they call it. They're breaking stories. It's every June. Of course, the show's over now. That's how it used to be. And they have this new actor, Jean Triplehorn, coming in, and they're looking at each other. What do we make her? What's her background? And they Fitz, any ideas? I said, you guys have met my then fiance, Natalie Schilling, right? Yeah. She's a professor at Georgetown linguistics. And, I'm a profiler, forensic linguist at Quantico. Why don't you combine the two characters and have the Alex Blake character having helped solve the Unabomb case as a rookie? Now she's teaching at Georgetown and also somehow a supervisory special agent / profiler / forensic linguist. So that's why when we finally met Jean Triplehorn, she kind of knew we kind of helped create her character. And that's when she said, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, good to finally meet you. So that was a fun time. So
yeah, that was a lot of fun. I also wanted to add another perk that I never got as a professor at Georgetown University was we never got a private plane like the agents in Criminal Minds get. When they get called into their cases, they all leap into their private FBI special agent plane and travel to their destinations. I'm sure you two are very familiar with that very special treatment that FBI special agents got, including your own private plane to go to your different destinations.
I think it was Spirit Airlines. Wait a minute, I think you're bankrupt now. We didn't have a plane there either. There was no such thing.
It was a private plane with 300 other passengers, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Anytime we went anywhere.
That's true.
And I'll throw out here too, then Ray, I want you to take over some questions, but how Natalie and I met was kind of different. I actually I worked the Unabomb case, and I was pretty good at language analysis. I already had a master's in organizational psychology, but I realized if I wanted to be taken serious, having great experience is very nice in helping solve the Unabomb case with language. But I was getting more and more tasks in the FBI, and Ray, we were getting friendly back then. You may have brought me a few cases, even with bank robbery notes or something like that. And I realized if I wanted to be taken more serious, I got to go back to school. I was thinking PhD, but I said, you know what, let me at least start with a master's. Looked around Georgetown University, and I didn't know Natalie at all, of course. And I put my application in, whatever. The Bureau ultimately wound up paying for my master's at Georgetown. But the first day on campus is I go to meet my advisor, and here it's a rookie professor, less than a year, I think, on the job, and it's Natalie Schilling. I said, wow, this ain't a bad deal here. So, and eventually, I went through this system legitimately, the old-fashioned way, studying, writing good papers, but ultimately, after I graduated, a few years later, life kind of changed, and we got together personally, but it's an odd and unusual situation of an older male student eventually hooking up with a younger female professor. Of course, it's usually the other way around. So to this day, I thank Natalie for not only giving me good grades, but going out to dinner once or twice back.
Well, I have to ask something before you, the good grade stuff and all that stuff. Natalie, was he a teacher's pet? Did he get any special favors because he liked you? Did he awe you with a lot of different things and gifts and things like that?
Well, when he says he got his degree the old-fashioned way, I guess people could take that in several different ways. But in all honesty, no. In all honesty, no. We were friends back then. I always tried to be as fair as possible in teaching with all of my students. I was impressed with Jim because of, him being an FBI special agent and, important investigations that he worked, like the Unabomb case. But again, I try to treat everybody equally and fairly because I've always really believed that everybody should be treated fairly and equally as much as possible. So in my conscious knowledge, no, I did not give him special treatment. So
a little bit of subconscious there. We won't go there, but a little bit of subconscious.
That's right. Yeah.
But, we'd like to start out, and I know we got kind of off track a little bit, but we'd like to start out by you telling our audience a little bit about you. Where are you from, and how did you wind up at Georgetown, and how did you get involved in this really, really, especially when you got involved, very unique field of forensic linguistics?
Yeah. Okay. So I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland in a rural area with its own strong, distinctive dialect, which I think part of my interest in linguistics early on came from being in an area with a distinctive dialect. My family before me wasn't originally from the area, so in a way we stood out. We spoke differently. My mom isn't even from this country, and so being brought up just a little differently, you notice the ways of speaking and using language around you that are a little different. So I think those seeds of being interested in language, especially dialect variation, that's been one of my specialties within linguistics. That came early on from my upbringing. Let's see. So I grew up in a rural area, eastern shore of Maryland. I began attending college there, but then later I went to college in North Carolina at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Go Heels for anybody listening who's a Tar Heel fan. And that was another really interesting linguistic and dialect experience because growing up in Maryland, you never really fit in linguistically. So anytime you travel a little bit north of Maryland, people may notice that you have a Southern accent and they comment on it. If you go to the South, as I did for school, people call you a Yankee and they complain about how you talk so Northern. And so these are some other pieces of the puzzle that led me to think, you know what, I want to study this more and figure out more what's going on with these dialect differences, and not just how the dialect differences pattern, but how people think of you because of the way you speak and the way you use language. So people's attitudes about dialect variation. Why are some dialects regarded well, others not so well? How can we look at one dialect like Southern American English and we might think of it, oh, that's so cute, that's so nice. People sound so friendly when they have a Southern accent. But at the same time, we might think, oh, people talk slow and maybe they're not as educated. So kind of this double-edged sword that when you have a noticeable dialect gets imposed on it. So I did my undergrad degree at North Carolina, and that was actually English literature degree, not a linguistics degree. I didn't even know linguistics was actually a field until a little bit later. When I started going to graduate school at North Carolina State University, I took a class in the history of English as part of the English master's degree I was getting. And that's when I realized that this whole way of looking at language, the scientific study of language, which is what linguistics is, that's what led me into linguistics. And that's when I said, oh, I can actually figure out all these patterns I've wondered about throughout the course of my life. And that's what I did. I got a master's technically in English, but then a PhD in linguistics, also from UNC Chapel Hill. And that was really the start of my linguistics career. I do have an actual Stanford connection. So I share with Natalie Rogers from Manhunt Unabomb. She was a teacher at Stanford, I believe, in the show. So I was there for a year doing a postdoctoral fellowship in linguistics there. And then worked for a year at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, in the Tidewater, Virginia area, and then had the great fortune to be hired as a professor of linguistics at Georgetown a year after that. So that's what led me. That was sort of the pathways that got me into linguistics. I started getting into forensic linguistics partly because of the fellow linguist at Georgetown, Roger Shy, that I mentioned earlier. So Natalie Rogers' last namesake. He's well regarded among linguists as I said, one of the founders of forensic linguistics, one of the first linguists to apply language science to looking at language evidence. And I've always been interested. I've been in academia for my whole career, but I was always interested in, well, I want to apply what I know beyond just the university. You know, there have to be societal applications for what I do in order for me to feel like my work is valuable. And Roger Shy's work in forensic linguistics struck me as a fascinating and important way of applying language science. We can look at anonymous communications and maybe be able to say something about who might have written something, or maybe spoken communication where can I give you some indication of maybe what dialect area they're from their language features. So part of my interest in forensic linguistics came from that legacy of Rogers. And then also I was very much influenced by your co-host, Jim Fitzgerald, in that regard. So when he came to take classes with me and to study with me, I was, of course, fascinated by the work he had done on the Unabomb case. Probably also, like me in my early studies, he may or may not have even realized there was a field called linguistics back in the day. You just know that you're interested in how different people use language differently and have different patterns to their language. What does that tell you about people? What can you discover about people from their language patterns? And so Jim actually invited me to come give some presentations at the FBI to be part of a training course. Jim, I believe it was a training course in forensic linguistics that you were running when you first invited me to speak there.
Yeah, we called it a seminar or forensic linguistic workshop for some reason. Ray, I think you came to one of them.
I did.
And 1 week, Monday morning through Friday. Well, I think we let them go at 12 noon. But yeah, it was very popular. And then I did 2 in 1 year, and I think starting in 2004. And I think, Natalie, you were there for all 4 of them. We had Don Foster. He was a English professor at Vassar. He came for a few. Dr. Rob Leonard, who's been a guest on Cold Red, he's been here. So we had a cross-section of actual linguist professors that would come in and teach. And I never called myself a linguist until I attained my master's in 2005 from Georgetown. I just said I was a text analyst or something like that. It didn't really matter. But yeah, I learned a lot. And I have to say, I now teach a course, and obviously Natalie and I together co-developed the Forensic Linguistics online program at then California University of Pennsylvania. Now it's Pennsylvania Western University. But so we teach courses in FL, in forensic linguistics. In my time in Georgetown, there was, Natalie, you may have mentioned forensic linguistics a few times in your classes, but there were no courses on forensic linguistics. So I had to learn, generative syntax, semantics, sociolinguistics, culture and sex and language and things like that, and then take them back and try to apply them to my cases. And Natalie was very helpful. Again, we're just kind of friends. She's my professor. I know she's grading me, but I would come with her with some questions, and she'd be very helpful in what do you see in this, and what do you see in that. I'll never forget once I was about to testify in a case, and the prosecutor asked me something. I was in, I think, somewhere in Texas, and I got Natalie on the phone, and Natalie, I have a linguistic emergency. I need your help. And she's there. This may be the first time ever, Jim, there's been an actual linguistic emergency. I just needed a definition or some way to explain something better at the prosecutor. But I remember very well my Georgetown University days, and Natalie was not my only professor. There were other good ones there too, and I got a lot out of that program, and it's a very strong program. And And so I was glad to invite Natalie there to teach. And but then, Natalie, you started slowly getting involved in cases, some civil, some criminal. Do you remember how that first morphed? Because actually I don't, so hopefully you do.
I don't specifically, except that when you start talking to people in different circles, they remember you, they get to know your name. So giving presentations to FBI personnel in connection with forensic linguistics, I probably started getting involved in casework from contacts that I made in that workshop in those early days of teaching. And I didn't teach forensic linguistics at that workshop. I taught linguistics. I taught my specialization in linguistics, which is sociolinguistics. So language in its social setting, including dialect variation. So variation by region, by gender, by ethnic group, by age group, education, those kinds of things. And then if a case, then, people come together for the workshop, then they disperse, and then a case would come up that involves language evidence. And people who, before doing the workshop, didn't necessarily know there was anything called forensic linguistics or even linguistics, and they might think back to that workshop and say, oh, I've got this communication that I'm skeptical that, it claims to be written by one person, but I really think it's somebody else. I remember there was something about using language features to profile and or identify authors. So let's contact Professor Schilling and see if she can help us in the case. So that's how I got started working on cases.
I find it extremely interesting, and I'm sure our audience does too, that you can determine an author based upon the written word. Now, I'm not saying you can determine the name, and in some cases you can if you have enough samples. But what is it that ties an individual into a written document that you're able to apply that to that individual? Is it, I know it's one thing is the spoken word, but the written word is different.
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be tricky with written communication. It can be tricky with both spoken and written. And I wouldn't say that even a linguist who's been doing linguistics for, 25, 30 years like me, we're not really Henry Higgins and My Fair Lady. I think that's the name of the person who could tell people like exactly what street in London they're from based on some little nuance of their pronunciation or something like that. So you can't necessarily always exactly pinpoint people from their language usages, but you can at least narrow things down. Writing can be trickier than spoken, you're right, because first of all, we don't have the audio signal anymore in writing. So it's reduced to what's on the page. So you can't, pronunciation gives us a lot of clues as to who somebody is and where they're from. And you don't have pronunciations when it's in writing, but you still have sentence structures, grammatical constructions. You have vocabulary items. So I remember Jim worked a case where somebody was writing something about a light bug, B-U-G, but they meant light bulb. I believe that was written language. And it turned out that was a very idiosyncratic usage and we even consulted with some dialect scholars. It was something occurring in the area of the southern U.S. And we looked all around for, well, how widespread is that usage? And it turned out to be very, very specific to actually one person, I believe. So that would be an example of a feature in writing that can help you pinpoint an individual. Even though there aren't pronunciations, there will be these vocabulary features. Some of them are sort of more aerial, they're more group features. So maybe if somebody's writing and they put, I don't know, like a lot of y'all or something like that, then you might think, is it possible this person's from the South? There could also be, like I said, some different types of grammatical constructions or sentence constructions. So if somebody wrote something like, the car needs washed, meaning the car needs to be washed, or I need to wash the car, that could be a clue. Maybe this person's kind of Midwest, where linguists know that type of construction is found. So those are some of the kinds of things that can occur in writing. Writing is also different from speech because we have more of a chance to think about it, and we might have some opportunity to maybe hide our features. And also when we write, very often we tend to write more standardly than we speak. And so standardization kind of can wash out some individual differences where we're just trying to adhere to grammar rules when we write. But still, even if you're consciously either trying to be very proper with your grammar in your writing, or you're trying to mask anything noticeable about yourself. You know you're a Southern user, a person who uses Southern American English, and so you're careful not to put y'all and stuff in your writing, like you're masking anything that might be distinctive about your writing. Or you might even, in a criminal communication, you might even be trying to disguise yourself as somebody else in your writing. But very often, a lot of what we do with language, including written language, is not really in our conscious awareness. So we don't even notice we're doing certain things. So clues as to who you are can leak through in your writing. So I might not realize that not everybody in the U.S. says needs wash or needs to be washed. And so I write, some kind of nefarious communication that has that construction. And people working in forensic linguistics can then say, hey, I think you need to narrow down, where you're looking for this suspect because of that.
Well, with that said, and that's a lot, that's really very, very informative, at least to our audience. And I know Jim and I talk about this amongst ourselves, and we talk about this with all our guests. All the cases that you've had the opportunity to work, what is the one that kind of sticks with you that's the most memorable case that you can say, wow, can't believe I was able to get that one. That was something else. Which one sticks with you, Nat?
Well, the most memorable case for me is actually one where I don't feel confident that we really have the answer yet, but it's just intriguing from a linguistic point of view, from this whole idea of here are some language features. What can you say about a person based on these language features? So I can tell you about that case. That involves spoken language, not written language. When sometimes I present on this case, say to students or to different audiences, and I call it the case of the mystery dialect. So it involved case of a girl back in 1981, I believe it was. A girl went missing. 12-year-old girl goes missing from her home in Seaside, California, on the West Coast. She had a number of siblings. The parents of the little girl, one day the girl's gone. The parents tell the siblings, she ran away. We're never going to talk about her ever again. That ungrateful daughter, she just ran away. She's dead to us. We're not talking about her. So the girl is gone. But about 10 or more years later, there's a missing, one of the siblings finally reports it. There's a missing persons report filed, but there's never really a full investigation. I don't exactly know why. Another 10 years goes by, and I believe the reason why this happened, so what happened is they were on an army base. The army base was closing. As it was closing down, they were trying to wind down various investigations that were still kind of open. So they had a cadaver dog. This is around, so the girl went missing in the early 80s, early 2000s. They have a cadaver dog alert at the house where the girl had lived. And so investigators in the case...
Natalie, just to be clear for our audience, cadaver dogs are trained to smell decomposing bodies, and they are highly effective, highly trained, and that's exactly what happened here. So something on that property attracted these dogs, and they said, hey, at least at one time there was a body here.
Right. And so detectives in the case, so then there was a full investigation launched because something's very suspect here. Did this girl really run away, or did somebody do away with her? And they suspect the parents, particularly the stepfather of the girl. So they question the mother and stepfather. And it's pretty sketchy, their responses, especially the stepfather. It seems like he almost comes close to confessing that he actually murdered the girl, and she's not actually missing or a runaway, but is dead somewhere. But there was no body found. There was a shoe found. They did digging in the yard and found a shoe, but no body. Around the same time, very shortly after the parents are questioned, all of a sudden in, I believe, Arizona, not California, a person surfaces and says, hey, I'm that girl. The girl's name was actually Mary Day, D-A-Y. So your audience can actually look up the case. I can tell you actually an interesting documentary that was done about it as well. This person, traffic stop, she says, oh, that's me. I'm Mary Day. I've been gone all this time. Here I am. I'm back. And this is after 20 plus years. All of a sudden, she resurfaces. And police are like, well, that's weird. Where was she this whole time? Now, all of a sudden, right after we question the parents and the dad's in trouble, this person, she surfaces. So maybe she's an imposter. Maybe she's somehow trying to, get her parents get these people off the hook or something. And one of the clues, one of the biggest things that made the detectives in the case suspect about this person is that she has the wrong accent. So this person is this Mary person who was born in upstate New York, lived there, spent basically her formative years, a number of them in upstate New York, a very short time on a military base in Georgia, but then basically lived in California, Hawaii. So these various aspects to her background, to her upbringing, but she happens to have what sounds like a very strong Southern accent, which was really unexpected for somebody who, with a background, basically you're from upstate New York, and then you moved around to some Army bases, but really didn't spend any significant time in the South. And it's a very strong, very striking accent. It's not a little subtle thing that comes out now and then. They did a couple of long interviews with her, and the accent persists throughout the whole thing. And she said she says, yes, I'm that runaway. I've been gone for 20 years. And in that intervening time, I mostly lived in California and Arizona. I made a few trips to the South, but that's all. So the detectives, so this is a linguistic clue that something is wrong, or that something really seems to be wrong. So the detectives contacted several linguists, including me, and said, hey, are we crazy? Is this a Southern accent? Can you tell us anything about who is this person? Where is she from? Are there some language features that can help pinpoint the origins of this person? So what I did, I worked with some of my students on this. We took 2 basically hour-long interviews, and we listened carefully and analyzed carefully in terms of what are her dialect features, what do we know about the regional or other origins of these dialect features. And she definitely had a lot of features of a Southern accent, including these features like y'all that I just mentioned. She referred to her father as daddy, even though she's a grown-up, which is a common address term in the South. And she had some Southern pronunciation features, like she would say something like, I'm going to see it down for sit down, like see it for sit, or set it down. She'd say, say that right on down. Like, just, it's hard to imitate the pronunciations, but sort of the Southern drawl where you have a vowel and you kind of you elongate it and you break it into several different vowels, like see it right on down, that kind of thing. But weirdly, there were some Southern pronunciation features that she did not, which made us really wonder, what in the heck, where is this person from? And particularly, one of the most noticeable features of a Southern accent is when people say things like, what time is it? For what time is it? So this kind of for I. Can you give me a ride to the store instead of ride to the store? And this is actually, among non-linguists and for linguists, this is a defining feature of Southern U.S. dialects. If you don't have anything else and you're from the South, chances are very high you have this, what time is it? But this alleged Mary didn't have that feature. So she had this, what seemed to be this strange mixed bag dialect. And so at first we asked ourselves, we're like, well, maybe she's faking it. And she doesn't really realize that she needs to say time for time, but she's putting in some other pronunciations and using y'all and some other features. But then we decided that was highly unlikely, because if you're going to fake a dialect that isn't your own, and you're not even very familiar with the dialect, you're probably going to fake something that's really noticeable about it, if that makes sense. So if you yourself right now are going to imitate a Southern person, you would almost certainly have that. Like even when I was saying sit right on down, I accidentally said rat for right, that for I again. And so it's just seemed weird. And also we know from studies of people imitating dialects that it's going to be really hard for you to consistently put on an accent or dialect that isn't your own over the course of an hour-long interview or 2-hour-long interviews, especially if during that interview you're talking to the police and you're also like faking a whole background for yourself. You're trying to say, well, I went to these towns in Arizona in the 90s and this and that. So she's trying to keep a story straight and faking an accent at the same time. That would be really, really, really cognitively challenging to do and highly unlikely. It would be very likely that you would be inconsistent. Sometimes you'd be putting on some accent and then sometimes you would forget because maybe you're thinking about what lie you're going to tell next about your whereabouts or something like that. So
can I ask you this?
You can.
Is it permissible or is it known? For instance, say if I decide, being from the Philadelphia area, where I say instead of water, I say water. I say it anyways, water. I don't say it right. But if I were to move to, say, North Carolina or Virginia, would I pick up some of the dialect there? And then if I were to move somewhere else, could I pick up some of the dialect there? Not that it would be consistent, but in my speaking, I may say different things. Like, for instance, I know my daughter who went to Virginia Tech, and then she wound up marrying a guy from Georgia. She spent some time down in the South. She'll come up, she says, "Y'all, I'll see y'all later." She says some of the things, it's that Southern dialect. And I said, "Well, you sound like a Southerner now. What's going on?" But because when you first said, Natalie, about this young lady, Mary, and you said, she had been missing for 20 years. And I thought, well, she could have spent some time down south. Who knows? She could have wound up down there for a period of time. But then she said, "Oh, I spent most of my time in Arizona and California." I thought, well, that kind of answered that question there. But is that something that you look at too as well?
Well, definitely. Yeah. We definitely considered how likely would it be that she would have this strong accent from later. So acquiring a dialect is a lot like acquiring a language in general. We get most of it in our very early years. So if you're born and raised in upstate New York, your core dialect features are going to come from upstate New York. Later in life, if you move somewhere, you might pick up some features, but you wouldn't necessarily pick up all of them. So yes, you can have linguistic influences, just like you can learn a second language, right? But if you learn it too late, chances are you're always going to have an accent in your native language. So if I would try to speak Spanish right now, I would have an American accent, American English accent. It wouldn't sound like native Spanish. So if somebody moved to the South as an adult or even an older teenager, maybe they pick up some things, especially some noticeable things like y'all, but there are going to be some other subtleties that you're not likely to pick up. Linguists have done studies of dialect acquisition and how good people are at picking up dialects at different ages. You're just not going to be able to pick it up like a native, just like you can't pick up a second language like a native unless you're really small when you start picking up the second dialect or second language. If this Mary person had gotten some Southern influences later in life, we still would have figured she would pick up these more noticeable pronunciations like time for time that she didn't have. So it just really didn't add up. It's a very complicated case where a lot of things just didn't add up. There was also DNA and go ahead.
I was going to say that the DNA didn't really help because there was different parenting connections there.
It's very complicated to me. One thing I've learned in my years of working on cases as a linguist is I definitely know to stay in my lane, and I know that I am not a DNA expert. And if I'm asked to give an opinion, to give an analysis of some language, in a way, I kind of don't even want to know the other stuff about the case. Like, oh, what's her DNA? What's that like? Because that's just not even my business as the person who's analyzing the language evidence, if that makes sense. You have to be careful about that. But yes, I do happen to know that one point in the investigation, they did do DNA analysis, and Mary was a match with the mom being her mom, if that, to my understanding of DNA analysis. And at one point, they even closed the case because of that match. But then they later reopened it because there was another cadaver dog alert at another house that family had later moved to after that Mary went missing. So it's all just very tangled and mysterious. And yes, the mom, there were a number of siblings, and the mom had had various children with various men, with various fathers. And so it's possible, and this was a theory the detectives had, that maybe this was a sibling. So the mom had various children, and not all of them lived together. Some of them had been adopted by other families or were, in foster. Mary herself had been in and out of foster care. It was a whole very complicated family situation. So it's possible that this person claiming to be Mary could have been, a half sibling or even a whole sibling, but somebody that the family didn't actually even know, that somehow came out of the woodwork to try to save mom and stepdad from being accused of murder. So it's a very complicated, convoluted case.
I always found that interesting because I was alongside of you as you were trying to put that together. And I thought DNA may be the solving factor in that. I mean, as a linguist, I'll always tell investigators or prosecutors, hey, get fingerprints or DNA. This linguistic stuff is great, but let's go with what's basically 100% provable if in fact there's a match. Linguistics is not always that.
Yeah, language evidence is not DNA evidence, and it's not fingerprint evidence, because DNA, as I understand it, even the tiniest little speck, carries everything you need to know to identify an individual. A language sample, even 2 hours worth of somebody's language during their police interview, that's only part of their linguistic behavior. It's not everything about them, if that makes sense. So it's not like a fingerprint that kind of encapsulates you. It just captures a portion of who you are and what you do. It's like a behavior. Like parallel would be like, gait analysis, where you look at how people habitually and routinely walk, like that kind of thing, compared to like if you're looking at a security camera and you're looking at the way somebody's walking and trying to pinpoint them from that. I think language evidence works kind of more like that. I can tell you the latest understanding of what's another piece of evidence that came into play in this case. So your audience might be interested in looking up. There was a CBS 48 Hours special that was done on this case, on the Mary Day case. So interested audience members could find out more about the case from watching this. It turned out even later. So this was a case that kept being open and closed. When they were making this documentary, you know how nowadays documentaries about crimes, about cases, actually sometimes influence the case itself. I'm thinking about, for example, what was it, the Menendez brothers case, where people got inspired to try to get them free based on, documentary, that kind of thing. So in the course of making this 48 Hours special, one of the people on the show interviewed this person who claimed to be Mary Day, and she happened to mention a new person in the case that had not come up before, a woman that she said she lived with shortly after she ran away. She maintained that she ran away when she was 12. Yeah, I lived with this woman. The 48 Hours team went and talked to this woman, and she says, oh, here, I've got a picture of Mary with some of my kids back, from, whatever year. So maybe Mary would have been, 14 or 15 or something at this point, not dead, but in this picture. And the photo was subjected to some kind of computational matching analysis, which I know even less about than I do about DNA analysis. But the analysts claimed that it was a very, very high match with the actual Mary Day, with photos of her before she ever went missing. And so the case was closed again and is closed now with the conclusion that despite that mystery dialect, it really was her the whole time. But I will say that the cold case detective that I worked with on the case, still not satisfied with that conclusion. And I have to say that I'm not either, because the dialect just really doesn't add up. So, yeah, so you asked, like, the case where I was really amazed at how linguistics really got us to a conclusion we never would have thought we could reach. This was kind of the opposite. It didn't end up concluding anything to me. It raised more questions than answers, but I do think it shows that language evidence can be really valuable and can cause you to, maybe you better not just accept some conclusion that you presume is definitive. Maybe it isn't. Maybe this language evidence leaves open a question that maybe 10 years from now we might have a better answer because we have that evidence.
Well, that's great that it raises questions. It raises questions where there were none. So that's a good thing.
Right.
That's a good thing. But I want to move on to this other thing here. I've known you've done a lot of training here in the United States, but I also understand that you've had the opportunity to go north and work with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. What is it like? Is it the same? Are they different? I have a lot of friends, some friends that, and I have one of my friends, Jim and I did, that was on here from RCMP. And they are a great bunch, and they love America, by the way. They love America. But what was it like working with them?
Jim and I did that training together, and I recall that it was a great group of people who, like just about everybody I've worked with in giving these training sessions in linguistics and forensic linguistics, that people are just so curious and open to learn more about language and linguistic differences and language evidence. And I've just always felt like everybody was very, like I said, eager to learn and like respectful of different people's expertise and just wanting to know that if there are sciences that can help us, even if we've never heard of them before, we want to bring in these people. What is this linguistics thing? And just people, the RCMP being very receptive to learning, to bringing in experts from different areas and learning from them. I've always felt that about the FBI as well, that people there have always just been always wanting to learn more and never being satisfied with, well, we're professional behavioral investigators. We already know how to do everything. We know how to solve cases, but in fact, the opposite, where people proactively reach out and say, hey, can you help us learn more about, say, well, dialect features or gender features, or how can we tell, are there some features, language features indicating deception in communications? So working with law enforcement, no matter what country that I've encountered, I've always been really impressed just how much people want to learn and how people really want to sort of hone their craft really finely. And they want to consult with outside people to see, well, can we improve on the way we're doing our job?
Natalie, you're generous with your time. I'd like to maybe end it with two different cases, maybe 5 minutes each. One of the first cases you worked from a criminal perspective was with our friend Jim Clemente. Of course, he hosts his own podcast, Plural, and he's been our guest here, I think season 1, Ray, if I recall.
Yes.
He brought you into a case early on where a person was already convicted. Can you give us kind of a thumbnail sketch with that? And it was kind of the first time you were thrust in the middle of something, even after the conviction. They're looking to overturn his conviction for an issue with an ear witness lineup. And it involved a sexual assault. Can you just, in a few minutes, walk our audience through that case and how you realize, hey, I'm just looking at the evidence, nothing else?
Yeah, I can try to do it quickly. This is the case of a person by the name of Eric Frimpong, who was a soccer player with the University of California, Santa Barbara. This was in mid-2000s, I think it was around 2007. He is accused of sexual assault. I'm not sure if it was a student or not, that the alleged victim in this case. He is, so he's accused. He is ultimately convicted, sentenced to prison, ends up spending 6 years in prison, and then gets deported. He wasn't a U.S. citizen. He was from Ghana. So he ends up getting deported to Ghana after having served time in jail, in prison. So the reason that Jim Clemente asked for my help in the case is that as part of the case against Frimpong, against the person being accused in this matter, as Fitz, you just alluded to, there was some what we call ear witness testimony. So this alleged crime took place in the middle of the night. It was dark. The alleged victim says that she couldn't get a look at the face. She didn't really see the person who assaulted her, but he said a few things during the attack, during the assault. And so the police detective, so this happened around 12 something at night. The next morning, around 8 something in the morning, police detectives go to the home of the alleged victim, and they play what they describe as a very short 5-second clip of a voice, and they ask the victim, is this the guy, is this the voice of the attacker? And she says, yes, oh my God, that's him. That's him. And so Jim Clemente was suspicious of that. He said, is that really a valid identification procedure? Do linguists talk about voice identification? We know that there's eyewitness lineups where you look at the photo arrays, and I guess we know those, can be problematic as well. And so he asked me about this, and I said, no, in many ways, that's very problematic how this whole procedure was set up or wasn't set up. And so he basically asked me if I could just, as an expert linguist, can I just give an opinion that would become part of a package in order to try to get Frimpong free, to get the case appealed.
The appeal was never an emotion for an appeal.
Yes, it was never successful. Several attempts for an appeal were mounted, but none of them were ever successful. But in this case, it was interesting because basically this ear witness procedure was basically faulty in any kind of way that a procedure could be faulty. So linguists have even studied this. They studied how good are people at recognizing voices, how good are people at these ear witness identifications, and what factors might cause somebody to be better or worse. So factors like how long had elapsed between the crime, between when you heard the voice during the crime, and then the identification procedure. How many voices were there? Was there one voice or was there a voice lineup? What was the content of the voice that you're playing? What did they talk about? Did they talk about crime or did they talk about something else? How familiar is the ear witness with the voice? How much of the voice did they hear? How much attention were they paying to the voice? All of these factors. Linguists who've studied these things, first of all, people are not very good at ear witness testimony. We're really not very good at recognizing voices as a rule. But factors like if you wait a while, if you wait 8+ hours overnight and then ask somebody, was that the same voice of a person who attacked you at midnight, that elapsed time makes your ability go down, your ability to do accurate recognition. Also factors like how much did the person say? How much language data is there? And the victim in this case said, well, he didn't say very much at all. One of the worst things in this case is when they talked to the victim about, well, what was said and what happened. She was very, very drunk at the time of this incident. And she said, well, I really don't remember much. But yeah, that's his voice. So the degree of attention that you're paying to the voice that you're then later asked to remember plays a big impact on how accurate people are. If your attention's not there, if you're very drunk, then chances are your ability to identify a voice correctly is not going to be accurate. And it was also a very suggestive procedure because they only played one voice. That was the voice of the suspect. As far as I know, they never even sought any other suspects. And they played him a clip from his police interview. So he's talking about, they're questioning him about that crime. So it's not, ideally you would want much more neutral content. You would want a lineup of voices. You would want more neutral content. I know you can't always do the lineup immediately after a crime happens, so there's going to be some, time elapsing. But some of these other factors, they could have better controlled for. They could have played more of a voice than 5 seconds. That's not adequate for somebody to do to do a good job. So all of these factors came into play.
And Ray, you and I, I'm sure in your career, I know, we put together dozens, if not 100 more photo arrays, photo lineups. I wasn't ever involved in any one in person. You have 6 people lined up. You see them like in the old movies. But the photo arrays you open up, and people can't look completely different. They have to kind of look alike. Not identical, but certainly, same basic features. So that's well established in the courts for eyewitness lineups or arrays. The courts weren't very clear on ear witness lineups, as Natalie just explained, and that sounds very unfair. A lot of linguists even study the old Lindbergh baby kidnapping case from the early 1930s. And I won't go into that whole thing, but Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, his baby was kidnapped, and he thought the baby was still alive, trying to get money. They meet the alleged kidnapper in a cemetery. He hears him talking, and 6 months, a year later, the police bring him in a room and hear Bruno Hauptmann talking. Yes, that's him. Now, I firmly believe Bruno Hauptmann was the kidnapper and the killer of the baby, but that wasn't a good ear witness lineup then either. And that part should have been thrown out, much like the Frimpong case. But Natalie, just real quick here, you also, one of your earliest cases, remember you came to me and said, well, Jim, what if he's really the rapist? And I'm providing this evidence that could help get him out. And I said, Natalie, you're not being asked to judge his guilt or innocence for the crime. You've been asked simply to one little slice of the entire investigation, and does it hold up to scientific protocols? And I think you explained very well early on that it didn't. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to get it thrown out. And this was before Me Too, Believe All Women, all that stuff. And I know you said, oh, well, maybe she really was sexually assaulted, and am I in the right place to do this? But to your credit, you kind of put that aside and say, I'm a linguist, here's the evidence. And I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's, I think, kind of how you were feeling back in the day when you put that whole report together.
Yeah, it's very important if you're a scientific expert, no matter what your field of expertise, and you're being called in as an expert witness in a case, it's very important that you stick to your piece of the puzzle, to your science. It doesn't mean you have to take a case if you don't feel comfortable with it. If I didn't want to do this case, if I said, well, I don't want to be a part of this in case I get somebody free from prison that shouldn't be free. But my part in the case was, and just like with the Mary Day case, where I don't really know much about DNA analysis, and I just didn't involve myself with the whole matter of the DNA. I tried to stick with what my area of expertise, what can I contribute? If I see something that people are doing wrong with the language evidence, then I'll just tell them, I'll say, I don't know anything about anything else in this Eric Frimpong case. I have no idea what other kind of evidence you may have or not have, what other kinds of witnesses have come forward. But what I do know is that including this identification, this voice identification in the evidence against Frimpong was not right. It should not have been done. It should not have been admitted into evidence, this voice identification procedure. And so I guess kind of being true to my science, to linguistic science, and say, no, that was just a bad procedure, regardless of anything outside of the language evidence in the case.
Can we get a few minutes on where we were exactly 2 years ago this week, and that's Putnam County, New York, and which you were the expert hired by the prosecution there in a homicide case, and Rob Leonard, our friend from Hofstra University, was hired by the defense. And we're all friends. There aren't that many forensic linguists in the U.S., and Natalie was asked to look at some factors in that case, and it got kind of interesting for your first courtroom testimony. Could you share that with our audience and a little bit about the case itself?
Yeah, it is interesting when you're an expert witness in a case. So you're hired by one side, somebody else might be hired as an expert for the other side. It's interesting when that other side is a friend and colleague of yours for many years, as the case with me and Rob Leonard. And this is not the only case that he and I have been on opposite sides on. I hope we're still friends. We both put our professional selves, we're serious about our profession, but we don't let being on opposite sides in cases come between us. It was an interesting case that involved a confession statement that the police had taken from the person who was actually convicted of a crime. So in this case, this involved the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. So unfortunately, we have another young victim, just like in the Mary Day case, or at least possibly in the Mary Day case. The suspect in this case, there were two guys who were found guilty, convicted, and spent many years in prison for this crime. One of the guys, okay, I'll just talk about the one I was more directly involved in. The effort was made to, the person who was imprisoned for the crime said there's a confession statement in the case, and it was brought forth that no, this is actually a false confession. It's a coerced confession. So therefore, I need to be freed from prison. So the linguist on the other side in this case, so the defense of Andrew Krivak, the person in prison for the crime, asked him, they said, well, we have this confession statement. The detectives in the case assert that this is a verbatim statement, the guy confessing to the rape and murder of this girl. What do you think of the language? Does this look like a verbatim transcript, a written version of what somebody would say in spoken language, in spontaneous spoken language? And the linguist for the defense, the expert on that side, took a look at the language of the confession and said, well, no, this isn't at all like spontaneous spoken language, and it's not like the language of the suspect himself, and it's not like spontaneous language in general, so the confession must not be valid because it looks like it's been manipulated. So
Natalie, can I interrupt
yes.
you here? There was never a recording of this confession, by the way.
Oh, that's
correct?
Right.
This was all a handwritten confession, which Ray, you and I have taken many of those back in the day. And now they're arguing over the recorded notes and the typed out confession. So never a recording.
Yeah, the argument is actually over. It's a confession statement of around maybe 8 to 10 pages long. I can't remember exactly. And it's handwritten. And it's in the detective's writing because the detective is the one taking down from the suspect. Okay, where were you on the night of the girls? Where were you? What happened? Tell me who you were with. Where did you go? And then distilling it all down into, okay, I hereby assert, that I did this crime, et cetera, et cetera. And the question was, well, was the language manipulated? And was the confession, is this evidence that the confession was coerced? And so the linguist on the other side, Rob Leonard, pointed to factors like, well, but you look at this, it can't possibly be a verbatim transcript of somebody talking because there's no disfluency, there are no ums or uhs, just like I was saying a few minutes ago when I was trying to get my thoughts together. There's none of that. There are no self-corrections. There are none of these stops and starts, like a false start where you start to say something and then you say, well, let me back up and say blah, 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 like we all do when we're talking when we don't have a script. There's none of that. It flows more evenly and fluently. It was also asserted that, look at some of the language in the statement. It looks like police, like kind of some phrasing that police use. For example, something like, I then put the body in the trunk versus then I put the body in the trunk. So this I and then in that order has been found to be a feature that is common in police discourse and not very common among people who aren't police. It's a very small detail, again, a small detailed language that might be able to tell you something about a bigger picture issue. It was also pointed out that, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff in this statement that somebody just speaking spontaneously about what they did one night, telling a story, they wouldn't put in. Why are there all the specific locations, the corner of 30th and or whatever, the specific locations talking about, well, we turned east on 75th Street before we got to the parking lot where we backed into the space instead of facing forward. And so it was pointed out, well, that's all very odd and seems like language that the police inserted into the statement. So therefore, the confession statement is bad and evidence of coercion, of police coercion in the matter. The police may be putting words in the suspect's mouth, trying to say, we need you to say this happened. We don't care whether you really, did it or not. We're going to frame you for this crime. So this was unusual because then I came in and I actually agreed with Rob Leonard and I said, yeah, no, this isn't language that's consistent with being just somebody spontaneous. Hey, I'm stopping in the bar and tell a story about what I did one night. I was like, no, it's very different language, but that this is a confession statement. It's a written statement that is basically, and linguists have studied how do confession statements get produced. And it's not simply, even if you had an audio recording, it's probably hours and hours of Q&A, question and answer going back and forth. And then at the end, you have a statement. You have a confession statement, a few pages long. That's kind of where you're distilling everything that you talked about. And you're putting it all together like in the correct order with the amount of detail that you need. So you're producing a document that's going to be evident, in your court case. You're producing a legal document, basically. And so we don't expect it to be absolutely 100% somebody's spoken language. It would be very strange if there's a confession statement where the detective is writing out what happened or what's being said, and he actually puts in ums and uhs and things like that. We don't.
Right. Did you ever put uhs and ums and coughs in when you were taking someone's confession?
No.
And that's what the defense was trying to say, because the uhs and ums weren't in there, that somehow it was false. So what I'd like to do while we're wrapping up here is when you went to testify in the courtroom, they wouldn't first even allow you to testify for two different reasons. Do you remember that? I know you do, but could you share it with you about who was in the courtroom with you and also the notebook?
Sure. As far as I recall, I actually did start giving testimony, but then they raised issues and questions and problems about it, partly because my husband, my now husband, James Fitzgerald, came into the courtroom with me and sat in the audience, and the defense team objected. Well, we know who he is. We know he worked on the Unabomb case. We can't have him in here. And he's, I don't know, unduly influencing her or something like this. We're like, okay. And then the second issue came, I had given oh my gosh, it was the longest testimony ever. It was like days and days. And I had given just hours and hours. And then they said, well, we hereby demand to see the notebook where she was taking notes while she was sitting in the courtroom. So those are the two issues that happened.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I'd have to agree with the undue influence of Jim. I mean, after all, he did influence you to marry him. So I think that goes without saying.
No arm twisting. So yeah, it was weird being in the courtroom there to support my then fiance. We were married after that, and I'm kind of being made the bad guy. So they have a whole separate hearing on that. This is all pre-trial hearing. I'm going to sum it up for Natalie. I know we're running late. I know she has things to do, but ultimately you were basically arguing you don't need a linguist in this case, and it's unusual when a linguist or any expert gets up there. You don't need one of us experts in this case. Ultimately, the judge agreed with that, and so no linguist was allowed to testify in the trial itself. So that was the good news. It went to trial. Natalie or Rob Leonard had nothing to do with any testimony in the trial itself. And it turns out the guy, after all these years, was acquitted. The conviction was overturned. He served 30 years in prison for the murder and rape. He was 19 when he did it. So he's out now. But it just shows you as an expert witness how things can kind of come backwards and bite you. And I'm just there as a friend walking Natalie in and out of the courtroom. And on the stand, she's waiting all this time for her first testimony in a courtroom. You've done depositions before that, but in the courtroom, and all of a sudden the first thing they're asking is about, we want to see your notebook, and we want to know who that guy is you were talking to.
Right. And I do want to stress, again, as in all the cases, I strive very hard not to have, my opinion is not about was somebody innocent or guilty. And I really, really feel very strongly that I'm not there to say, because the prosecution hired me, I've got to help them prove he's guilty. It's not my job. My job is to talk about what the language evidence shows and doesn't show. In this case, it did not show, in my opinion, there was no evidence of linguistic manipulation on the detective's part. And I had to, in good conscience, say that there wasn't any such evidence. And I also, honestly, I felt that for the first thing for the defense team to confront me on was who my partner is. I honestly almost felt like that was kind of sexist, really. Like, it's my man who tells me what to do and how to think. And that probably probably wasn't a good move on their part because it made me mad.
And when she gets mad, Ray, her testimony is off the charts.
There you go.
Ray, just any final questions about these cases? I want to let Natalie put her website out there.
I don't. I want to be able to have Natalie talk briefly about her book, English in America, A Linguistic History, and where people can get that.
Oh yeah, that is it's an audio video lecture as part of the Great Courses lecture series. So people can just Google, Great Courses, or these are put on by a company called The Teaching Company, where they can find it. They can find it on Amazon, on all the usual channels. But it's not simply a book. It has a companion book, but it also, you can listen to it as a podcast. You can watch it as a video. So multimedia format where I go into, the history of American English. How did it become different from British English? And what's it like now? Where is it going?
And Natalie, in closing, you're doing a lot of work now with trademark and copyright infringement. Give us a thumbnail sketch of that and throw your website in there too, so people know how to reach you if their company has some startup using their name, or they're a startup and they want to use some other company's name, among other things.
It's hard to do real quick. Trademark and copyright is a total separate area of forensic linguistics. What that involves is consideration of, if you have two trademarks or potential trademarks, a linguist might be called in to look at how similar, how different linguistically are these two names. So maybe one company is suing another or issuing a cease and desist letter to another company saying, you can't use that product name because it's too similar to my product name, essentially. So that could be a matter where a linguist can come in and give an opinion about how similar do the terms look, how similar do they sound, how similar in meaning are they. So a lot of what linguists do when it comes to working as an expert in trademark and copyright cases is give analyses in terms of the meanings of terms, of words and phrases that people would like to trademark. So we talk about similarity and difference, and also is a word or phrase strong enough to be trademarked? Is it something that's highly distinctive, or is it basically something that people use generically? And so you don't really have a right, one company doesn't have a right to keep other companies from using it. So for example, the case of App Store, how you can go to your App Store and buy, different apps for your computer or your phone or whatever, that term was actually under dispute. So Apple at one point sued Amazon because they were calling their App Store an App Store, and Apple was saying, no, you can't call it that because that's exclusive to us, to Apple. But Amazon saying, oh no, everybody uses App Store because it's a store where you go buy things we call apps. App doesn't mean Apple, it means application, as in a computer application. So that's an example of where a linguist could come in and say, well, I can talk about what app means and what it doesn't mean, and I can give you evidence in terms of how people are interpreting meaning, and therefore helping to resolve a trademark dispute.
Natalie, what's your website?
The best way to find me currently is on LinkedIn. Very, very shortly, I'll be launching my website, NatalieSchillingConsulting.com. And my last name is Schilling, so make sure you put the C in there, the German spelling.
Linguistic perspective, that's important to know. My last question is, do we know what's for dinner tonight?
I thought you were cooking.
All right, I'll handle that. Ray, we have a shout out to someone, don't we?
We do, Jim. We wanted to give a shout out to a Cold Red fan, Whitney Monk from Salt Lake City, Utah. Whitney, her friends, and family are loyal supporters of Cold Red, and we thank you for your continued support. Thanks, Whitney.
Yes, thank you, Whitney. We very much appreciate that, and your friends and family. So everyone who's listening and watching this episode of Cold Red, I want to thank Natalie Schilling, and of course my co-host, Ray Carr. I wouldn't be here without him. I wouldn't be here without Natalie either. Thank you. Our musical director is Rick Schilling, and we'll say for the first time that's Natalie's brother, both talented musicians. Thank our producers, Matt McLaughlin and Matt Robinson. And please, everyone out there, subscribe, like, listen to, go to coldredpodcast.com and give us ideas, comment if you will. And remember, know where you are, know what you're doing, especially around this upcoming holiday season. We're holding safe so far out here in the U.S., so let's know what's going on around you. If the small hairs on the back of your neck start going up, that's most likely for a reason. So everyone, thanks again, and see you next time on Cold Red.